Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gary Howling. I'd like to welcome you now to this afternoon's Bushfire Facts Live webinar, brought to you by Great Eastern Ranges Initiative in conjunction with Griffith University and Australian National University. I'd like to start today by first acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that I'm joining you from today. I'm joining you from a little bit outside of Shell Harbour on the New South Wales South Coast. And so I'd like to acknowledge the Dharawal and Yuin peoples as the First Nations peoples of the land that I'm joining you from today. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners, past, present, and emerging, of all of the lands that you're joining us from today. And if we have any traditional owners with us today, I'd particularly acknowledge your presence. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we kick off this afternoon's session. First of all, I'd just like you to be aware that you're all currently on mute. We will have facility during the course of the presentations today for you to be able to ask questions. If you'd like to pop your questions, please, into the chat box, and we'll be keeping an eye on them during the course of the presentations. And at the end of the presentations, we will start to open up to a little bit of questioning conversation with the speakers. I should also like to make you aware that the webinar this afternoon is being recorded. So if anybody is not comfortable with that, please let us know and we'll make provision for that in the after process. First of all then, I'd like to kick us off today by introducing Professor Brendan Mackey. Brendan Mackey is a professor at Griffith University in Queensland and director of Griffith's Climate Action Beacon. Brendan is the co-chief investigator of the Bushfire Science Project, which is a collaborative research project between Griffith University and Professor David Lindenmayer from the Australian National University. Brendan is kicking off today's webinar with an overview of the Bushfire Project and the key findings that came out of the research on the link between climate change and bushfires. Over to you, Brendan.
Thanks, Gary, and good afternoon, everyone. Next slide, please. So I'd also like to acknowledge the people who are the traditional custodians of the land, pay respect to the elders past and present, and I extend that respect to other Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples. And the Gold Coast, where I'm talking to you from, is situated on the land of the Yungan and Combinberry peoples. This is an overview of our webinar. I'm going to give a brief summary of the key findings from our assessment of the relationship between climate and wildfires. After that, we'll hear from other members of our project team, in particular our co-lead investigator, Professor David Lindenmayer, who's going to be talking about bushfire science and what it has to say about post-fire logging and hazard reduction burning. We'll then hear from Dr. Chris Taylor, who works with Professor Lindenmayer at Australian National University, who's going to be talking about what bushfire science has to say about logging and wildfires, risk of wildfires. That will be followed by Dr. Pat Norman from Griffith University, who will be looking at forest regeneration and the potential for citizen science to help with monitoring and evaluation. And I'll come back and conclude with some points about research gaps going forward for wildlife conservation and recovery. Next slide, please. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Our project did a couple of things. One thing it did, it assessed the peer-reviewed scientific literature on 5 key issues to do with climate, bushfire, forest management, and wildlife issues. And these are all available to you on the project website in these 5 reports. The first looked at the question of, does climate affect bushfire risks or how does climate affect bushfire risks in the native forests of Eastern Australia? The second looked at how our native forests, our eucalypt forests in southeastern Australia survive bushfires. The third looked at the relationship between native forest logging and bushfires. The fourth on looked at the ecological consequences of post-fire logging, and the fifth addressed the question of what does the science have to say about prescribed burning of native forests to reduce the risk to infrastructure from bushfires. And for each of those reports, our methodology was to identify all the relevant peer-reviewed scientific literature and assess what it had to say about these questions. And for the first report, we found 52 relevant papers. The second report assessed 117, the third 33, the fourth 74, and the fifth 72nd. So what we've tried to do is to assess what the evidence is regarding these key issues, and you'll be hearing some of that evidence presented in the webinar today, but there's a lot more that can be found in these reports, which are all available on the project website. Next slide, please. In terms of climate, perhaps the key point that the science is very clear on is that I think we're all aware that the world is already experiencing 1 degree of global warming above pre-industrial levels. In Australia, that's actually close to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And this has led to a major shift in our climate in ways that directly affects fire weather. In particular, we've seen a decline in winter rainfall in southern Australia and increasingly higher temperatures in spring and summer. And this has resulted in the last 50 years a marked increase in the frequency and severity of dangerous bushfire conditions in Australia. And particularly in southern and eastern Australia, this has included a lengthening of the fire season. And that map is from the Bureau of Meteorology and shows an increase in the annual frequency of dangerous fire weather days across Australia since the 1960s, 1970s. The significance of the decline in winter rainfall is that we've seen about a 20% decline in rainfall, and that's mainly occurred in winter, not in summer. What this means is at the end of winter, at the beginning of spring and the fire season, we have very, very dry fuel conditions, and hence a major increase in dangerous fire conditions. The second key point that the literature is now telling us, next slide please, is that this trend, climate change driven trend, is projected to continue in the future, unless of course we have the world community acts to limit global warming to below 1.5 degrees. But the current trajectory we're on, if you like, if we continue to emit the kind of emissions we are, greenhouse gas emissions we are, the projected climate change that will result will further increase these dangerous fire weather conditions actually over most of Australia, and particularly in southeastern Australia. We will see longer and more severe fire season, more days of high, very high and extreme fire danger, more area burned, and conditions where it's increasingly difficult to implement fire control measures. And that map on the left is from the New South Wales government's excellent regionally downscale dynamic climate change model, which is a projection, again, under current emissions scenarios continuing for the second half of this century, the projected change in mean precipitation for winter. So you can see the trend for southeast New South Wales is a continuing winter drying, and of course an increasing frequency of heat wave conditions in early spring. The kind of conditions that we saw come to a head at the beginning of our 2019-2020 mega fire season. Next slide, please. So that's the end of my presentation, introductory presentation, and two of the key points about climate change and fire risk, wildfire risk. I'll now hand over to David Lindenmayer for his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Brendan. I'll just briefly introduce our next speaker, Professor David Lindenmayer. Professor Lindenmayer is a world-leading expert in forest ecology and resource management, conservation science, and biodiversity conservation. He is among the world's most highly cited scientists, having published 817 peer-reviewed papers in international scientific journals and 47 textbooks, including many award-winning and seminal works. David Lindenmayer is a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Science, a Fellow of the Ecological Society of America, and was appointed an Officer of the Order of Australia in 2014. So I'll now invite David to now present a short summary of key bushfire facts on the impacts of post-fire logging, sometimes inappropriately called salvage logging, and the effectiveness of hazard reduction burning. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you, Brendan. I'd just like to acknowledge the fact that I'm presently working on Ngunnawal country here in Canberra, but much of the insights into the presentation we're going to see in a moment is from the wet forest of Victoria, and that's country of the Gunnakurnai, the Tunurong, and the Wurundjeri nations. So the first thing I want to do of the two parts that I have to speak about is this notion of salvage logging. In fact, it should be called post-fire logging because in many cases we're actually not salvaging anything, but in fact damaging the ecosystem quite substantially. So if we see the next slide, this really relates to what happens after major fires. So in particular, we've talked a lot, we're going to talk about the insights from after the 2009 fires in Victoria in the wet forest there, but our insights also apply equally to the major black summer fires that we experienced in 2019, 2020. So let's move to the next slide, please. So this is a topic that we've worked on since 2004, and we wrote a book on this back in 2008, and there have been literally hundreds of studies globally now on the impacts of post-fire logging. We go to the next slide. The experience in an Australian context, which is mimicking what we see in other parts of the world, is that post-fire logging has the following range of effects. So it removes almost all of the large old trees from fire-damaged ecosystems, and that will set back habitat recruitment for up to 2 centuries. And that has enormous impacts on the array of species that are cavity dependent in many forest environments. It radically alters the composition of the vegetation in many forest ecosystems, particularly resprouting species that recover in special ways after fire are very badly affected by post-fire logging. Things such as tree ferns, daisy bushes, a whole range of eucalypt species that would naturally recover from resprouting. We know from some empirical work led here at the ANU that post-fire salvage or post-fire logging leads to major impacts on soils. So we have a dramatic reduction in soil nutrients and an increasing soil drying and change in the soil composition and structure. And those effects last for up to 80 years and perhaps even longer. Other work indicates that there are large reductions in water yields from post-fire logged catchments, and there are very substantial negative impacts on a whole range of groups of biodiversity from birds, plants, invertebrates, and other groups. Other work from the North America, particularly the northwestern part of the USA, suggests that post-fire logging elevates short-term fire risk and also medium-term fire risk. So these are quite substantial impacts. If we go to the next slide, a little bit of data here from a paper published in 2018 indicating that bird species richness is lowest on post-fire logged areas. We go to the next slide. A little bit of data here in the red boxes. These are areas that have had a series of fires and also post-fire logging, and soil nutrients are demonstrably lower, ranging from ammonium, potassium, organic carbon, and sulfur. Go to the next slide. So if we look at the range of kinds of logging that takes place in natural environments, post-fire logging is clearly the most damaging form of logging. And if we look at the next slide in particular, where we have ecosystems that naturally resprout, which is what we see in most of southeastern New South Wales and northeastern Victoria, these kinds of environments are recovering naturally and do not need further disturbance in the process of natural recovery. Now, the reason why post-fire logging is so substantial in its effects are that ecosystems are dealing with two very intensive disturbances in rapid succession. So we know that many ecosystems can deal with high severity, high intensity fire that is rare, and other ecosystems can deal with frequent low severity, low intensity disturbance, but almost no ecosystems can deal with frequent high severity disturbance. So that's one of the major underlying ecological principles for why post-fire logging is so detrimental to so many aspects of so many ecosystems globally. Okay, so let's move now to the second topic, and that's to do with hazard reduction burning or prescribed burning. If we go to the next slide, please. Essentially, the definition of hazard reduction burning relates to a planned burn, and it's a fire in the non-wildfire season. And in particular, what we're talking about here is not so much ecological burning or other kinds of burning. It relates mostly to property protection and the protection of human lives. Now, the key issue in understanding the effectiveness and impacts of hazard reduction burning is that actually the major driver of fire behaviour is fire weather and climate. Now, underneath that, we also know that management interventions like logging also increase fire severity, and Chris Taylor is going to talk about that after me. But under extreme weather conditions, hazard reduction burning has shown to be less effective. Now, why is this important? Well, this is important in an Australian context and also a global context, because the amount of extreme fire weather is actually increasing quite dramatically. So in Australia, the assessment by Brendan's part of this collaborative project indicated that the number of extreme forest fire danger index days has actually increased tenfold in my lifetime since the 1960s. And that's when most house loss occurs and most loss of life occurs, when the forest fire danger index is severe or higher. So this is really important to understand the effectiveness of hazard reduction burning, but also its limitations. So let's go to the next slide, please. So one of the key things that we understand from the empirical work that's been done, led by people such as Jeff Carey and Phil Gibbons here at the Fenner School, is that hazard reduction burning is most effective when it's done every few years and it's done close to infrastructure. And that means that it's the quality of the burning, not so much the quantity. Now, this is really important because in many cases, what's often called for after major wildfire seasons is a substantial increase in the amount of burning. And in places like Victoria, that led to targets such as burning 5% of the state every year. But what that meant is to meet those targets, people often had to burn very remote areas that were a long way away from human infrastructure and habitation. And that often meant that there was relatively limited impact of hazard reduction burning on protecting key natural assets, key human assets and human lives. And normally what we hear then is people say, well, if only we'd had more hazard reduction burning, then we would have had no problems and that would have led to major risk reduction. When in fact, that's not the case, particularly under extreme conditions when we lose lives and we lose people's property. And so it's important to recognise that under those extreme conditions, hazard reduction does not always work. And I'm going to give two examples in the next slides. So if we go to the next slide, please. This is actually a photograph that my wife took of her mother, my mother-in-law, in an area where there was extensive hazard reduction burning in Victoria in 2009. And so they lost almost all of the assets and infrastructure on their property, despite the extensive hazard reduction burning that was done. So there's an enormous aspect of human tragedy associated with wildfire, and it is important for people to understand that often despite the amount of hazard reduction burning that takes place, particularly under the extreme conditions that we're getting now with climate change, that there will be occasions, perhaps an increasing number of occasions, where hazard reduction burning has less impact and less effectiveness. And if we go to the next slide, we can see that in the extreme. This is a photograph taken of the township of Marysville. I was working in Marysville in December 2008, and you could virtually not see in front of your face because of the extent of the smoke created by hazard reduction burning around the town. Within a few weeks after that hazard reduction burning operation in February 2009, almost all of the township was destroyed, and many of the lives, a large proportion of the lives lost in those 2009 fires were people that were killed in that fire across that township. Okay, I'm going to leave it there and hand across to another of our speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, David. I'll now introduce our next speaker, Dr. Chris Taylor. Dr. Chris Taylor is a research fellow at the Australian National University's Fenner School of Environment and Society. He specializes in spatial analysis of forest ecosystems and disturbance regimes, remote sensing, environmental modeling, land use, and forest certification. Chris will now talk to us about the link between logging and fire.
Thank you, Gary. I wish to acknowledge the Gunai, Kurnai, Tanarong and Wurundjeri people upon whose respective lands we conduct our studies on, and that their sovereignty was never ceded. And I'm currently speaking from Wurundjeri country. So I'll be talking today specifically about fire severity in the Mount Nash and in the Mount Nash forest ecosystem, and looking at the broader disturbance patterns across the Mount Nash and Alpine Nash forest ecosystems. So to begin with, if we go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is the extent of the Mount Ash and Alpine Ash forest ecosystem. If we go back one, sorry. Yep. To the left, we see the city of Melbourne. And so it is in a quite confined area of high elevation and where the highest rainfall occurs. It covers roughly about 190,000 hectares. Next slide, please. The Mount Nash forest ecosystem are defined by the iconic Eucalyptus regnans or Mount Nash trees. It's often accompanied with a very thick and lush understory of particularly in the wetter areas of rainforest species and long-lived tree ferns. Next slide, please. And its relation, the Alpine Ash forest, is a bit shorter, but still they're defined by tall trees, but the understory is a lot more open. Next slide, please. These forests have been subjected to extensive clear fell logging over many decades. So clear fell logging is the removal of all merchantable trees and the remaining slash and debris left on the forest floor and then burnt in a subsequent post-logging fire. Next slide, please. The aftermath can be lasting. This is a photo that I took in the Talangi forest. On the right-hand side, you can see tree ferns that could be up to a few hundred years of age. On the left was a logging coupe that was cut in 1969. So some over 50 years later, the evidence is still there of its impact. Next slide, please. So what we did after the 2009 fires, we conducted a spatial analysis of fire severity across 2 Mount Nash forest sites, looking at the relationship between stand age and fire severity. Next slide, please. So we looked at forest ages spanning from the seedling stage through to the pole stage. And next slide, please. through to the old growth stage. Next slide, please. We looked at two separate sites. One was up on the Mount Disappointment Plateau. The other one was south of Marysville. They're about 56 kilometres apart. And then we looked at different times that these sites were being burnt in relation to the wind change and zoned them accordingly. Next slide, please. Then we looked at the different classes of fire severity. So there's class 1, which is where the crown is consumed in the fire. Class 2 is where it's scorched. And the lower severity classes, classes 3 to 5, are more or less where there's variable burn severities in the understory. Next slide, please. So we looked at the stand age and grouped these areas. So we've got the old growth, which was 300 plus years of age, but then it was also accompanied by, in proximity to younger stands of forest, ranging from 0 to 5 years all the way up to 40 to 70 years. Next slide, please. The previous disturbance history over the past several decades before the 2009 fires were mostly through clearfell logging, and that's what determined much of the younger age classes of that forest. And then we've got the older forest in what is known as the O'Shanassy catchment, which is the green area. Next slide, please. And then we overlaid the fire severity mapping on top of that. And what we were able to do is, if we go to the next slide, please, is establish a non-linear relationship between fire severity and stand age. So with crown consumption, with crown burn or crown consuming fires, we saw it peak around about 15 years of age, and then it would decline rapidly after that. And then we did it with the combined classes of crown fire and crown scorch, where we see it peaking, but there was a more gradual decline, but not as dramatic as the crown burning fires on their own. So what we're able to look at here across our two sites was that there was quite a distinct relationship between stand age and fire severity when the fire was burning through these forests at the most intense part of February 7th, 2009, where fire danger index was at its maximum. Next slide, please. So what does this mean across the broader landscape? Well, what David and I did last year was that we looked at the disturbance patterns across the mountain ash and alpine ash forest ecosystems and conducted a fragmentation study. So what we see with the mountain ash and alpine ash forest ecosystems is that there's been a dramatic change in the disturbance patterns over the past 20 years. So if we go to the next slide, please. In 1999, we can see that the red areas are areas that have been intensively disturbed, mostly through clearfell logging. Orange areas indicate areas that are within 200 metres of that disturbed area. Green is between 200 to 1,000 metres from that area, and blue is over 1,000 metres from a disturbed area. So what we see over the next year, we see it increase. Next slide, please, to 2004. Then we see 2009, we see the impacts of high severity fires, crown burning and crown scorching fires across the landscape. Go to 2014, we see the logging continue, 2019. And if we look at planned logging, in the next slide, please, we can see that the area of blue has declined dramatically and the area of red has expanded dramatically. So what we see with the ash forest is that about 19% of it's been clearfell logged, which equates to just over 30,000 hectares. This is the alpine ash and mountain ash forest. 4% has been logged and severely burnt in a fire, and about 11% has been burnt in a high severity fire. So overall we're looking about 34% of the area that's been directly disturbed. That might not sound, you might say that there's 70% left, but if we go to the next slide, what we can see is that area of yellow, which is the area of 200 metres from disturbance, is actually quite significant. So what we worked out is that about 70% of the ash forest ecosystem is either being disturbed or is within 200 meters of a disturbed area. So it is a highly fragmented ecosystem, and there are very few core areas of undisturbed ash forest left. So if we go to the next slide, please. This is a photo that I took from the summit of Mount Torbreck in 1998. Views like this are quite rare, where you look over an unbroken ash forest landscape. We go some 20 years later, that's the view you get. Oh, well, that's the view I got when I was up there in 2016. It more has been logged since then, but that's becoming more the view that we see across these landscapes that are unburnt. We're seeing them significantly disturbed, and we're seeing those remaining undisturbed areas getting smaller and smaller. And this is cause for great concern about what are the future prospects for this unique ecosystem that is on Melbourne's doorstep. And I'll conclude on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Chris. Our second to last speaking slot is going to be with Dr. Patrick Norman. Dr. Patrick Norman is a research scientist for the Griffith Climate Change Response Programme at Griffith University. He specialises in assessing impacts to forests using remote sensing and volunteered geographic information. Pat will now present on the citizen science facets of the project, including the development of the app that community members use to record data in the field. Over to you, Pat.
Great, thanks, Gary. Great to be here. Hope you're all enjoying it so far. It's been a wonderful set of speakers. So today I'm going to be talking about the Black Summer Fires Mapping and Data Collection Project. So a bit of a side project. But firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which I speak from, which is the Ngunnawal region. And I'd like to extend my acknowledgement to elders past, present and emerging. Next slide, please. So as you can see, we've kind of had our project has been around a set of reports and a big heap of information. But aside to that, we've also been undertaking a large-scale spatial analysis and a citizen science component as well. So in order to kind of tie those two together, we really need to know what's happening in a broad area as well as really fine scale details. So combining the difference between, or combining the similarities in the information we can get from citizen science and from remote sensing, it can really become a powerful tool. So we were hoping to develop an app and get a series of questions out there and get some people involved to see if we can track how the fires have burnt through the forest, as well as tracking some of the forest recovery. Can I go to the next slide, please? So to do this, we developed an app and we got it as a bit of a proof of concept to see if the data that we can collect about the forest and the fire recovery will be useful for us going forward. So we built a trial app using the Nest Forms platform. So this is actually an external software that we could kind of just get our data, our questions in there and get people to kind of register in. So we chose that app because it allows us to get really easily some geographic information from people, because a lot of the other web form apps is actually quite difficult to allow for that. So we were hoping, and we undertaken this to then reassess, to have a look at how we can compare the remote sensing with this on-ground data. Next slide, please. So to do this, we set up a range of questions on this app. About site characteristics such as vegetation types, so rainforest, eucalypt forest, wet eucalypt forest, etc. Landscape position, gully, mountaintop, vegetation development stage, whether or not the trees were small to large, and it takes a little bit of discretion from the users. And luckily we had some really great partners from GER's, Great Eastern Ranges extended network, who provided some very useful information. So these people kind of know about their forests, which was excellent to run this trial. So we also got the users to have a look at how the forest had burnt, so that burn severity and in different strata. So this is different levels of the forest. Was the fire just going in the understory, or was there canopy scorch? We also got them to register how the forest is recovering. Are you seeing new buds growing off the trunks? Is the canopy starting to regrow? Kind of those questions. We also got the citizen scientists to take photos of any animals that they saw in their plots to see if we could see if any threatened species or what species are actually moving in, or which species are managing to persist in highly burnt forests. So just for the next slide, I'll just be running through some of the early results that we got from this. So after about 230 records, we saw that there were some clear differences of fire severity between the different vegetation types. So this is really excellent because it ties back in with the scientific literature, showing that those drier, shrubby eucalypt forests actually burnt at a higher severity than those wetter forests, such as the eucalypt forest with fern and herb. So that's generally the wet eucalypt forest, and rainforest. So as you can see on the right-hand side, this is about the sampling effort that has been done so far in each of the forest communities. So we were very happy with this because it ties back in nicely with the findings we found from the reports. Next slide, please. Another significant find was that the regrowth areas, those areas with smaller forest, smaller trees, actually burnt to a higher degree. This also follows on with some of the, particularly on with what Chris Taylor had just talked about in that last speech, that older trees, that older forest actually burns at a less severe rate. So the findings we got from this citizen science app is really great, and it's excellent. It's good. It's encouraging for us going forward because we'd like to upscale this a bit. So just before I go too much further, the next slide, I'll just run through what our website looks like, and along with some of the fire maps. Yeah, so here's our landing page for our bushfirefacts.org website. We have a bit of media, so if anyone's been on this before, you'll be very familiar with this. A bit of a background as well as some of the reports down the bottom. But if you go to the top, there's a fire maps tab. So this is what I'm going to be talking about today. And this is where you can track down and get access to some of that remote sensing analysis that we've done, as well as tapping into some of those citizen science records. So here's a little bit of a background of the project, as well as a little paragraph just in case the map's not showing as it should. So once I scroll down a bit in this video, the map on the left-hand side, those colours actually represent the fire severity for all the fires between Gippsland to around Rockhampton through that 2019-2020 time. As you can see, it's a devastatingly large area, but each of those points, the coloured points, are actually citizen science records that we've gathered during our assessment. And luckily for this little map, you can actually click and filter out some of those records. So if you can jump on and do this whenever you please at bushfirefacts.org, and it actually pulls up some of the records. I've just selected which columns we're interested in to share, but we've actually got a lot more data than that. You can also access the selected filtered out images and to show kind of what you're looking at that site. But if you go back onto the main map and click anywhere away from the points, it reback filters to all the records. As you can see, most of the records are around the Bateman's Bay South Coast area, provided by those wonderful partners from GER. There was a couple of records up in the higher areas of Kosciuszko and also a few just north of the Hunter. But as you can see, most of the sampling was done in that area. We also saw some wonderful submissions of animal species, including that wonderful shot of a powerful owl in amongst the burnt landscape, which is excellent. Good to see that they're persisting. And then if you just click on all those, you can scroll through each of those forest recovery photos. So it's quite rewarding. Some of those came in quite early, and to see that forest regenerating. Bit sad in others, but yeah, no, it's excellent. So just if you can go to the next slide, please. So we'd love to upscale this app because currently it's just been limited to those 2 working groups, but we would really love to get it out to the public. I think it was such an emotional event as well, socially, that I think there's a lot of movement and everyone would love to get in the forest and see how their forest is recovering and compare it back to some of the other areas that were impacted by the fires. So I think there would be a great bit of movement. In order to do this, we'd have to upscale this app because our nest forms component wouldn't allow for a large number of users. But really, we'd love to expand our sampling area to include from Gippsland to, say, the whole extent of the 2019-2020 fires. Thank you, and I think that's all of my speech.
Thank you very much, Patrick. We're very close to the end of our speaking session now. We've just got one more quick speaker to give a final presentation before we're going to go into a Q&A session. Just as we're going into the Q&A session or looking ahead to it, we've noticed that there have been a few questions starting to pop up in the chat function. Please do feel free to add questions in there and also follow along with any answers that are being made live as they're appearing in the chat box. Anyway, in terms of our final speaker, I'm just going to hand back briefly to Professor Brendan Mackey, who's going to talk a little bit about gaps and future needs in relation to the project moving forward. So back to yourself, Brendan.
Yes, thanks, Gary, and thanks to my colleague for their excellent presentations. So that map on the left is basically the same analysis that Pat showed. It's based on time series analysis of sentinel data, showing the footprint of the fire in terms of burn severity classes. I'm sure many of you have seen similar maps because our colleagues in various state government agencies and universities have been very busy doing similar kinds of analysis with similar data sources. And I do want to acknowledge all the great work that's being done by them. Some really important publications have been coming out, and there's more in the pipeline, I know. Here are some statistics from our work over the last year, which is a paper which is in preparation. You would have seen some of these numbers before. If you look at that first row of white letters, what we've got in the fourth column, that 5.7 million, that's the total area of forest and woodland that burned by the mega fire of 2019-2020. But we looked at the fires in a bioregional context. So we looked at that fire footprint in terms of the IBRA sub-regions, because we wanted to be able to look not just forests generically, but forests in an eco-regional context. And so these numbers show two very important things. A lot of forest burn, 5.7 million hectares, but a lot of forest within the bioregion within which those forests are situated did not burn. So within the impacted IBRA subregions, there's 25.5 million hectares of woodland and forest, of which 5.7 million burn. So yes, an awful lot of forest burn, but an awful lot of forest didn't burn in the summer of 2019-2020. Two more statistics to note. In the last column, you can see that within the fire perimeter, only 10% of the forest within the fire's perimeter was unburned. And we call these fire refugia. They're the habitat areas, the patches of forest within the fire perimeter that did not burn in 2019-2020. So there's two important facts here. 90% of the 5.7 million hectares burnt at some severity, and only 10% didn't burn. A lot of forest burnt, very little of the forest, that landscape that was impacted did not burn. And there's still a lot of forest outside the forest perimeter the fire perimeter that didn't burn. So this raises two critical questions we really need to be thinking about going forward. How do we best manage the forest within that fire footprint? the 90% of the forest that burnt at some level of severity, and the 10% of the forest that did not burn, the fire refugia. And secondly, how should we be managing the 78% of the forest within the impacted ecoregions that did not burn last summer? So we need to be thinking about both the 5.7 million hectares that did burn and how we manage that, and the remaining 20 odd million hectares of forest that did not burn last summer. Next slide, please. So thinking about those two big questions, some knowledge gaps are apparent that we need to be giving some more attention to. These unburnt fire refugia patches within the fire perimeter, what species are dependent upon them? And similarly, what species persisted in situ under the different fire severity classes? David Lindenmayer, I know, and colleagues have published papers which show even in severely burnt patches of forest, certain species are able to persist. We also need to be thinking about what information on the forest ecological condition is now needed by land care organisations and network agencies and land stewards in terms of forest management for wildlife protection and conservation and restoration. And how does forest policy, planning and management need to change or have to change for wildlife habitat protection and restoration, particularly in light of what the bushfire science is now telling us about climate change? The climate has changed. We can't wind the clock back and unchange it. And all the projections are these severe fire conditions are going to increase in the coming decades. We also now have very good evidence about the negative ecological impacts of certain forest management practices. So what is it that needs to be changing in terms of our policy planning and management? And finally, what is the role for citizen science? How can we best deploy citizen science apps and engage our community better in helping to get scientifically useful information about forests and wildlife and fires, and how can we use that information to better inform bushfire recovery and resilience planning? So thank you very much for your attention. That's the end of the presentations, and I think we're moving now to Q&A and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Brendan. Excellent wrap up to the final presentation session. I'm actually now going to invite our good friend John Dee to join us now. John is known to a number of you as a radio broadcaster and social entrepreneur, but John's also been assisting us in this project with a number of the products that have been developed. John's actually now going to lead us through the Q&A panel session, so I'm going to hand over to John to MC that session.
Thanks very much for that. Can everyone see me okay? I'm John Dee, the co-founder and managing director of the Do Something Foundation, and I'm going to host the questions for today's webinar, and I'll be doing that from Katoomba here in the New South Wales Blue Mountains. If you don't know, Katoomba is home to the Gundungurra and Darug peoples, and I'd like to acknowledge their elders past and present, and any First Nations Australians who are joining us today. I'd like to start by asking a question of Brendan, if I may. Brendan, having listened to your presentation, how certain are we that climate change will make fire weather even worse in the future?
Thanks, John. I should perhaps mention, to preface my answer, just by also noting that I am involved in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6th Assessment Report, which is currently underway. I'm a coordinating lead author for Chapter 18, which is a regional chapter actually focused on our region, what's called the Australasia region. So there's two parts to that question. One is the science about the observed climate change that we've experienced over the last 100 years, which is in the meteorological record, and the science around how we can attribute changes that we see in the climatic record to global climate change. And that's really the science of that is what's assessed and documented by the IPCC in Working Group 1, which has done that. So that was pretty well established. Those links were pretty well established in the fifth assessment report that was released about 5 years ago. Since then, in Australia, that research obviously continues. Since then in Australia, the Bureau of Meteorology and the CSIRO and colleagues in universities have been analysing the weather records in Australia and using these global climate models to undertake what's called climate attribution studies. So, the short answer is a lot of research has gone into this, and there have been some very robust publications coming out of CSIRO and BOM researchers, which have established very clearly that fire weather has got dramatically worse since the 1960s and 1970s, and identified the causal links, the changes in the weather systems from global warming that have driven that. And as I mentioned, in southern Australia, a lot of that has got to do with the decrease in winter rainfall. It's been about 20% decrease in winter rainfall and higher, hotter spring temperatures. And both those trends are all projected to continue into the future. And we can't wind them back. So even if we were to miraculously cease all fossil fuel emissions and emissions and deforestation degradation tomorrow morning, right, there's still a certain amount of climate change locked in with those same trends. So the shorter answer is we're very certain.
Now, for anyone watching now, if you do have questions, we're getting a few questions coming in. Please put them in the chat here on Zoom. Next question is for David. David, we've heard a lot about salvage logging. Now, if fuel load is one of the major determinants of fire risk and severity, is salvage logging one of the solutions? Some people say it is, some people say it isn't. What's your view?
I think the bottom line in terms of salvage logging is that it has such enormous impacts on ecosystems that it really constrains and impairs recovery of ecosystems after fire. And as I was saying in my talk, no ecosystems in the world are geared to deal with the double disturbance in rapid succession. One of the important things that's come from work that Chris Taylor has led and is replicated in other studies around Australia and the world is that when forests are post-fire logged and then regenerated, the forest architecture is changed in such a way that it actually makes the system more flammable. So logging, either post-fire logging or traditional or conventional clear felling, actually adds to the fire burden, which will last for up to 40 years after the logging operations have taken place. So salvage logging actually adds to the fire risk, not only in the medium and short term, but actually even up to 40 years after the operations have taken place. So what might seem like a solution is actually a problem.
Pat, if I can go to you next, we've got a question that's come in for you. Looking at, you talked about citizen scientists. The question we've had in is, how confident can we be that the validity of citizen science data, how sure are you of that, particularly when it's informing on the ground practice?
Oh, yeah, it really depends on the questions being asked and the kind of approach from the app's end. So provided you ask those right questions to say, really explicitly say what kind of forest it is and maybe say the forest size and that expected vegetation area, along with some images as well, because then we can help go back and validate. So the accuracy of people's GPS is a little bit of a determinant as well, especially in heavier forests. But at the spatial resolution we'll be looking at, the mobile phone is generally more than good enough. So to reiterate, yeah, it's really on the questions being asked at our end, as well as those photos.
And for people who want to be citizen scientists, who want to get involved with your project, how can they get involved in this?
Well, we're really hoping to ramp up our making of this app in the short future. We're currently underway at with some colleagues at Griffith to help construct this app, and I'd love to get it up and underway by the end of the year. So, but there's some factors that will determine this.
Well, good luck with that. Now I'm going to go to Chris and Brendan with the question. I'm here in the Blue Mountains, as you both know, as everyone knows who's watching. We had a huge amount of our World Heritage Area burnt out. One of the most common things that I heard on radio, TV, in print, online, a lot of people said, what about traditional burning? You know, our first Australians knew how to do this. So from your perspective, as both of you as experts, Chris and Brendan, what role do you see traditional burning playing in future fire management? Chris, maybe start with you.
Yeah, thanks for that, John. In Southeast Australia, and I've been talking with people from Wurundjeri people, Gunai peoples, and Tanarong peoples, and what I've been told is that there's a process of rediscovering those traditional practices, and there's an enormous amount of knowledge that is yet to be communicated to non-Aboriginal people like myself. So, my role in that is that at the moment, we outside of the Aboriginal community know very little, and particularly with colonisation, and it had such a huge and disastrous impact on the peoples around this area. A lot of knowledge was lost and has been rediscovered, and I think it's really important for the Wurundjeri people, the Gunai people, and the Tanarong people in this area to rediscover that for themselves, because they're the custodians of that knowledge, and that we be open to what they've got to teach us. So the cultural burning, from my limited knowledge, is quite different to the broad scale fuel reduction burns that are applied across the landscape and other management strategies. So we have to really be open to, I guess, a significant change in our thinking of how we integrate with the landscape when it comes to the time where the traditional custodians choose to educate us on how to change our ways. Brendan,
if can you? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree very much with what Chris said. And just to pick up on that last point, that there's a fundamental difference between cultural burning and its purposes and its effect, and the kind of broad scale annual area target hazard reduction burning that's being put in place by government agencies. And that is going to increasingly become problematic, due to climate change and increasing dangerous fire weather, conditions.
David, I'm going to come back to you, if I may, on, I guess, one of the other issues that was raised very heavily in the media during the Black Summer bushfires. A lot of people said, well, just look at all that fuel that's in our national parks. Why aren't we doing more to burn that so you don't have such severe fires? In your expert opinion, does fuel reduction, burning in national parks, help to reduce the risk and spread of fire? What's your view on that?
This is a complex area, and I think we often need to think about what is it that we're trying to do with hazard reduction burning, and that is, I think, fundamentally to protect people and protect property. And the data on house loss and loss of life shows that hazard reduction burning is most effective when it's done frequently, and it's done very close, within a kilometre, basically, of people's houses. And so it's expensive to do. The window for hazard reduction burning is shrinking because of changes in climate. As Brendan was saying, we're seeing drier winters. So what we need to do then is focus our resources where it's most likely to have most effect. And so in many areas of national parks and reserves, hazard reduction burning is going to be done very remote from people and from infrastructure, and therefore have less effect than it might otherwise do. But we also need to be aware that under extreme conditions, because of the effect of fire weather and climate on fire behaviour, we actually do need to we need to recognise that hazard reduction burning will have much less effect under those conditions, which are increasingly common. So I think there is a need to rethink how we do hazard reduction burning and think about its effectiveness, particularly in terms of ecological effectiveness. We know that fuels are generally recovering to pre-fire levels within 5 years. So I think there needs to be a move away from this, let's just burn as much country as we can. It costs a lot of money. It has limited effect for a limited period of time before we're back to where we started. In fact, there's some evidence to suggest that if hazard reduction burning is done done once and then left for long periods of time, we could actually be making some systems more flammable, not less.
Talking of hazard reduction, Alistair had a question, which I'll put to you, and if anyone else wants to comment, please jump in. Here, Alistair said the implication of the observations about hazard reduction burning and high intensity fire weather suggests that hazard reduction burns will become less effective. Have any other bushfire mitigation activities become apparent or clear to you?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think there's several answers to that. One of the things is that Chris Taylor's work that he's led shows that fire severity tends to be lower in old growth forests. So one of the things that we do need to be doing is thinking about how we can recover the old growth estate. Victoria at 77% smaller than it was 25 years ago. So that's an enormous loss in that space. The second thing I think is really important is to look at new technologies for rapid detection and rapid suppression to limit the sheer size of some of these fire environments. And we also need to look at the flip side of this in terms of where are people living and what are the risks and what can be done about that, and instructing people, for example, where you live, John, about where are the risks going to come from, what are the approaches under extreme conditions, should people even be in the way of these kinds of these events. So we're going to have to deal with the legacy of a long-term change in climate, but also a long-term change in the flammability of many ecosystems as a consequence, for example, of past logging operations.
Now we've got a question that's come in anonymously. They've asked, how do we prevent the disaster that took place recently at Perup due to a prescribed burn? How do we stop that from happening again? Who wants to put the hand up on that one?
Well, I'll come back to that too. That was a disaster in terms of impacts on animals such as numbats. I was horrified to see that, particularly after so much work was put into recovering populations and captive breeding. And I think there is a need to think more deeply about why those kinds of areas might be being burnt, and were they close to human habitation? Were they close to infrastructure? Were they really likely to have an impact on protecting people's lives and property? And I think there's a need to rethink the strategy. The Victorians learned very quickly that burning 5% of Victoria every year was A, impossible, B, was counterproductive, and C, it was much better to focus on where it's most effective, which was what we were saying before. So sadly, that was really a savage own goal in Southwest WA this week, and I hope that we don't see too much more of that kind of tragedy.
Does anyone else want to make a comment on that before I go to the next question?
Yes, John, and really it's a comment in response to the last two questions. So I think where this is all pointing to is the increasing importance of spatial planning as a fire mitigation strategy, because what we're really talking about is reducing the risk to people and to built assets of wildfires, of dangerous wildfires. So I think spatial planning, as David was talking about, will become increasingly important. We really need to be giving more thought to spatial planning, particularly in peri-urban areas, and how we can avoid placing built assets and valued forms of infrastructure, in locations that expose them to high and dangerous fire risk.
Now, one question I'd like to ask Chris, someone has alluded to this issue. If you look at the environment we have in Australia today, there are many parts that have been developed that in a way that has really changed the local landscape. And is traditional burning relevant to that kind of environment? Is the new knowledge, I guess, that's been built up over the years, in some areas, is it actually been passed on to, local fireys who've been doing it for 40 years or more? I've certainly met some people like that here in the Blue Mountains. How do we deal with that issue of the big change we've had in the way we've changed our environment?
Well, first and foremost, we have to be open to listening to the First Nations people and their knowledge that they are custodians of. And I, for one, am not going to talk on their behalf, because I'm not a custodian of that knowledge. However, the landscape in which that cultural knowledge was practiced has changed. You're correct. I spoke with a Tanarong elder who spoke about traditional burning being applied in the valley floors along the river where they camped, but they didn't necessarily burn up into the mountains. And that was just one person's account, for example. And but that valley now has been largely cleared for agriculture, and different plant species have been put there. There's a lot of weed invasion, weed incursions onto that landscape. So it's dramatically changed. And this is where there needs to be a partnership, I guess, with Western science and Aboriginal science, and a collaboration on how we can actually solve some of these wicked problems that at the moment we don't necessarily have the answers for.
Now, I've got another question that's come in. I think we've got time for a few more. So if you've got one question, please throw it in on the chat. I'll throw this open to the panel if whoever wants to answer this. Is anyone on the panel aware of any peer-reviewed science to support broad-scale hazard reduction burning as it's currently practiced? Who wants to take that on?
So there's some work done in Southwest WA by Boer et al., which suggests that more hazard reduction burning leads to less high severity fire. I'm aware that a colleague of mine is looking at this in detail, suggesting one of the problems with that analysis is that the really long unburnt areas where fire severity is lowest was largely missing from that analysis. I've just responded to a question in the Q&A that the Victorian experience has been that a focus on targets is often ill-informed. It's associated with what we call Goodhart's law, where you create a target. It's a little bit like NAPLAN, those kinds of things. You create a target and then everybody shoots towards the target rather than thinking about what it is that they're trying to achieve. So if we come back to what are we trying to achieve with hazard reduction burning, we're trying to stop people from being killed. We're trying to stop people from losing their houses. How do we do that best? Then we look at the work led by Phil Gibbons in 2012, published in PLOS One, showing that house loss is most often under extreme weather conditions. Prescribed burning makes a difference. It's not a huge difference, but it makes a bit of a difference. And it's done best regularly and within 1 kilometre. So those distant areas that are full of numbats that get fried are not helping. And the distinct possibility is that without some spatial planning, as Brendan talks about, we could actually be making it worse in some cases.
One of the things that was interesting, I'll throw this to whoever on the panel wants to answer it. It was very interesting for me being here in the Blue Mountains. Sarah Hanson-Young came up, who handles environment for the Greens, and I showed her around some of the key fire grounds here in the Blue Mountains, thanks to a fire captain who was showing us around. If you look at the effectiveness of some of the efforts we made here in the Blue Mountains. Some things worked really well, some things didn't work very well, as we all saw. Have any of you been talking to fireys on the ground to find out what are the best ways of suppressing bushfires, so that as you go through your research, we identify solutions that aren't just there at a science level, but also can be implemented on the ground by firefighters? Who would like to take that on?
I can have a little bit of a go at that. I think the solutions will often be ecosystem specific, because there are some ecosystems that really do not lend themselves to hazard reduction burning and fire and strict fire suppression. The tall wet forests, the Gondwanik rainforests are places that you wouldn't intervene in that space. I think there's a role for cultural burning in some areas, but it needs to be done on First Nations people's grounds, in the sense that it's their intellectual property and their cultural property that's been developed over tens of thousands of years. I also think that there's a role for technology here for rapid detection and rapid suppression. And there's some deep thinking to be done about what we've actually done to some ecosystems to make them more flammable than less. And Chris Taylor's work in that space is really important. So that tells us, for example, that we shouldn't be logging areas close to towns and communities because of that elevated fire severity. So there are going to be different solutions in different ecosystems that's going to need a level of sophistication that we haven't yet had in this fire space. But the Black Summer fires clearly show that we absolutely have to engage with that science, the level of sophistication, the kind of thinking around this space, and not simply the media response was we should have more prescribed burning, because that's a blunt instrument that sometimes will be counterproductive and of limited value for a short period of time.
You mentioned rapid detection and rapid suppression there. Here in the Blue Mountains, it was a good example where I remember looking at what was a small fire, had one helicopter thrown at it, which didn't seem to do very much. And yet that ended up becoming a very big fire, because on talking to the fire captain locally, he said they were in a situation where they were having to bid amongst different brigades and almost beg for fire cover from aerial fire cover. Is there a role here for some kind of national aerial firefighting fleet? It just seems that we don't have that many major aerial firefighting tankers to do the kind of rapid suppression you're talking about. What's your view on that? And if anyone else has a view, I'm keen to hear it too.
I think we have to rethink what we're doing in this space. So yes, rapid fire suppression through aerial suppression is really important, which means that we need to have the assets here in the country, because everywhere else in the world, their fire seasons are now expanding. So we can't expect to have access to the kinds of helicopters and planes at the times that we need them. So we need to have our own response, and that's what Greg Mullins and others were calling for. And it's simply inexcusable for a Prime Minister to say, I don't hold the hose. Actually, the Prime Minister holds the wallet that needs to support those kinds of things. But I also think that in many cases, when you have extreme weather, pyrocumulus clouds and the like, and heavy cloud cover, you actually need other forms of technology, such as drone technology, to help with detection, and also that you can have unmanned vehicles to be able to drop payloads of water very precisely in places very soon after a fire is ignited, when there is a chance of control. So this is why I'm calling for a rethink on how we do things, to use the technology we have, to use the Indigenous history that we've had in partnership with those people, and rethink what we're doing given the understanding that we now have through projects like this one.
I'm going to throw a question at each.
Sorry,
John. There you go.
Add to that one too, and I very much support David's call for a rethink here, a reset, and I think part of that has to be how we frame what it is we value, or how we value our forests. And I think we need to stop seeing forests as a threat and a risk, but rather as an asset that needs to be protected and conserved. When you stack up all the benefits to people that you get from the ecosystem services that our native forests provide, it's extraordinary. Clean water, biodiversity, carbon retention, you know, I could go on. Ecotourism. There's many, many, many benefits that provide real, tangible, economically valuable benefits to it. Our native forests are an asset. We really need to stop thinking of them as a threat. And I think that's got to really kind of underpin this reset in how we manage them, particularly in terms of fire risk that David's referring to.
You raised a good point there, Brendan. I'm going to keep you here on screen to ask you the next question. Janet asked us the question, you mentioned threat there. She said, I'm concerned in the relatively recent focus on dangerous trees in firefighting. These are often old, large habitat trees, she says. I'm a CFA firefighter, and the training on this topic doesn't talk about thinking about other choices and management to avoid felling these trees. And the question is, how do we get good info about other strategies to protect these large old habitat trees and their importance? What's your thoughts there?
Well, I guess what we're doing with this project in assessing the peer-reviewed scientific literature and seeing what conclusions it will support and making this information available is kind of one contribution to that process. But I think when it comes down to those kind of things, I'd like to handball that to maybe Chris and David, because I know their work in Victoria has been very much focused on that kind of on-ground forest operations and its kind of ecological impact.
Chris, let's hear from you, if we may.
It's a tricky situation because even just on a survey trip that I did last week, they're clearing all these dead old trees that were killed in the 2009 fires along the Marysville Woods Point Road. And what's happening is that these trees are falling down, they're crashing onto the road, and you know there is that human safety element that needs to be considered. It's a complex issue to deal with, how you sort of weigh up the pros and cons of each. And so yeah, I might hand over to David to comment more on that, but it's where I saw this particular operation being undertaken, it was quite concerning seeing these large old trees being cut. What I think would be needed is a greater degree of transparency on, why certain areas have been cut. Like, has that tree presented a significant threat to human safety? Has it been assessed, or has this strip of forest been assessed that's being cleared, next to a road? Just so that there's a greater degree of confidence in the decision-making behind the balance between protecting life, but also protecting the environment as well.
Yeah,
David.
yeah, no, that's some good points from both Brendan and Chris there. And I think in many ecosystems now, these large old trees are increasingly rare. And in a place like Australia, we have a disproportionate number of animals that are strongly associated with those trees, more than anywhere else in the world, which is quite a conundrum when you think about it, because we don't have woodpeckers and other animals that excavate cavities. So it takes much, much longer for these kinds of resources to develop. Yeah, we have such a large proportion of our fauna associated with them. And in many ecosystems, we actually have to work a lot harder than what we're doing to maintain those trees. So I think we are not treating that resource in the way that we should be to protect biodiversity and other aspects of forests as well, because large old trees store way more carbon than smaller trees. So we need to respond. For example, I've just seen a question come up from Sean about clearing 40 metres either side of roads. Well, that's absurd in terms of many parts of Australia. The most significant vegetation is roadside vegetation. And it's often the only part of the landscape that hasn't had significant land clearing, particularly in an agricultural context. So we need to reject those kinds of knee-jerk reactions and understand that some of these areas are actually very significant, and in many cases they will not be a hazard in terms of fire, nor to human health in most cases.
Now, the question from Ian Pulsford, I'm going to throw this one to Pat. Ian said the science presented today provides very compelling arguments for forest policy, forest management policy changes. How can this information be communicated to the public and government land managers and policymakers? What's your thought on that?
Oh, it's ensuring that that it gets to mainstream media. It's a lot of our, sometimes our scientific output doesn't really generate as much media as we would hope. So I guess it's really ensuring that there is something in place within unis to ensure that it kind of gets to that level of the public being able to take that information in. Sometimes a lot of our literature is locked up within paid journals as well. So I guess it's really just ensuring that our scientific literature and our output is broadcasted to the public, and that public knowledge is kind of helped to be guided in that way.
Now, talking of that outreach to the public, Catherine Clare has got she's made some very good points here about, and I'm going to paraphrase her question. If you think about all the solutions that all of you have been coming across, private landholders are really critical to get them on side to enact some of the preventative measures, some of the suppression methods that are available. Once you've identified the solutions down the line, how do you think, and I'll ask you this, Pat, but others feel free to jump in, how do we best communicate that to the private landholders? What potential, are there any role models? Are there any solutions you could suggest?
Yeah, I guess it's ensuring that the landholders understand the importance of their habitat on their property, both for protection of ecosystems as well as for the bushfire risk. And understanding those is quite a difficult thing. Land for Wildlife does a wonderful job as far as that ecosystem and acknowledging the importance of landholders' kind of properties, but actually getting across the fire risk and everything, I think that would really come down to local council, I guess, would be one of the things. What are your other thoughts on that, other panel members?
I was in a fire conference yesterday, and I saw a remarkable tool that's been developed called SimTab. And essentially, what it is, it's a diorama in a box, and people in a local area. In this case, it was Coringo Chase area outside of Sydney, and they were able to see what the landscape looked like in terms of this diorama of the valleys and the incised areas and the ridges. And then there was a discussion of risk, habitat types, all those kinds of things around what was essentially a sort of an inverse of a pool table. And it seemed like a really good medium to be able to discuss the competing values, the environmental aspects, the likely fire spread, all those kinds of things. It was quite an innovation that was less abstract and more tangible for people to be able to interact with in the real world of where those particular people were living. And I suspect that a similar kind of approach, for example, where you are, John, or others online here, might be able to get their heads around the complexity and some of the competing values in these kinds of spaces.
Very last question, because we're going to wrap up around 1:30 as we promised. I want to get a 30-second answer from each of you, if I may, to this one question. Final question: what does the research suggest are some of the key things that we should be doing to reduce future fire risk by managing our forests differently? Chris, if I can start with you.
First and foremost, we need to listen to the people of First Nations and be better educated on the thousands of years of their cultural legacy of managing this landscape, which they did up to colonisation. We have to rethink the way we look at the landscape as well, you know, from our own perspectives. In the bushfire context, and Brendan actually raised this point before, and I agree with him, forests are seen as a threat. And often I think that when a bushfire happens, trees become sharks on land. If, you know, when a shark attack happens, everyone says we've got to go into a shark cull. And these knee-jerk reactions are often very unhelpful. The forests that, you know, that are surround us are actually an incredible asset, and they need to be seen as an asset as opposed to a threat. And once we shift that thinking, corresponding management actions and the support for those management actions will be a lot more progressive than currently what they are.
Pat, your 30 seconds.
Ensuring that we maintain that old growth estate, and that those older trees are still maintained in the landscape, and also to understand about which vegetation types are most susceptible to fire, and kind of get a better grasp on ensuring that we know at a landscape level of where the risks are, and risks to both human and ecological risks.
David?
I think beware of people on certain television stations after dark with simple solutions, because there aren't. This is a complex set of issues. In some places, logging is contributing significantly to fire. In other cases, the simple mantra of more prescribed burning, more fire in the landscape will lead to less fire, I don't think will work. And I think we need to embrace this notion of the interplay of ancient traditions and thinking with modern technology, and the contributions that can be added to there.
Brendan?
Yeah, I think we need to, you know, if we think about what do we mean by risk, okay, so risk is the likelihood and consequences of something happening, of some harm befalling a valued asset of some kind. So in this context, the hazard is dangerous wildfire. And we know that that's being driven by fire weather conditions, and that they are worsening due to climate change. And there's not much we can do to reduce the hazard. But the other two factors in a risk assessment are the exposure of the thing of value to that hazard. And we can certainly address that in terms of our built assets and infrastructure through better spatial planning. And the third factor in a risk assessment is vulnerability, which we can think of as the resilience, if you like, of an asset. And in terms of our ecosystems, that's very much a function of how we're managing those systems and what we're doing to them. So if we start to, you know, have a better understanding of the consequences of a rapidly changing climate for the hazard, we really start to give some serious thought to spatial planning, to start to minimise the exposure of our assets to that hazard. And we have a really good rethink and reframing of what our forests are for and what we're doing with them, and actually valuing them as an asset. I think we'll be on a good pathway.
Well, we'll wrap it up there. Now, for people who are watching, if you do want more information, data sheets, information, there's video interviews that I've done with Pat and Brendan and David, go to the website, which is bushfirefacts.org.au. That's bushfirefacts.org.au. Lots of great information on there that I thoroughly recommend to you. I'd like to thank Brendan, Pat, Chris and David for being on here today. Thank you to Gary Howling for stepping in. I had a broken down car, which is why I was late getting to this. And thank you very much to Tandy Spencer-Smith for doing so much behind the scenes work in making this happen. Thank you very much for watching. And as I said, one more time, bushfirefacts.org.au is a great website. Do check it out. I'm John D from Do Something. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll leave it there. Thank you.